ce soir, j'ai l'immense plaisir d'avoir Jean-Louis Cohen, qui n'a pas besoin de beaucoup de présentations, en effet, qui est très bien connu de vous tous. Jean-Louis est architecte, il est le plus grand, à mon avis, critique historien d'architecture en France. Oui. Et il est professeur en histoire de l'architecture à la New York University Institute of Fine Arts. Dans ses actualités, il vient de livrer une très grande expo au musée Pouchkine à Moscou, sous les Corbusier, et un grand livre avec Faidon, The Future of Architecture After 1889, right? Since 1889, merci. En tout cas, c'est un travail majeur. Jean-Louis, il est dans les comités scientifiques de plusieurs institutions, les MoMA, les Centres canadiens de l'architecture à Montréal. Il est aussi le créateur de la Cité de l'architecture et du patrimoine ici à Paris et l'auteur de nombreuses publications. Donc, je tiens à remercier particulièrement Jean-Louis d'être ici parce que je sais qu'il a un emploi du temps assez chargé. Il vient directement de l'aéroport et il repart bientôt. Et donc, un grand merci vraiment pour cette présentation.
Merci Alessandra. If I understand well, I have to speak in English tonight.
Yes, my students don't speak French.
Okay, it's a little weird, but for me to speak in English in this particular auditorium where I've spent much time as a student in the very turbulent years 68 and the following ones, and then as a young teacher, the technologies were different. You had to come with your screwdriver, a spare bulb, and a spare fuse because typically carousels were inefficient and often didn't work at all. The rows were a little denser. And there were more students in the rows at that time. It was less comfortable, but I keep a great memory from these courses, and I guess some of the students too. So today I wanted to dig a hole, if I'm using this, an underground metaphor, the metaphor of the mole. We'll dig a hole in some pages of my research of the past years and maybe some pages of research to come, responding to your invitation to discuss, if I understand well, problems in underground architecture or problem in invisible architecture. And I will try to combine these two themes, maybe with an excessive focus on the war years, on the years 1939 or even 37 to 45, the Second World War, related to research I did for an exhibition on show last year in Montreal at the Canadian Centre of Architecture, and which also has led to what I think is an incisive and useful book entitled Architecture and Uniform. Preparing this lecture, I realized that I had only used maybe 20% of the material I had collected over the past 25 years to do the show, so I'm convinced that there will be a new version, an extended one at some point. So let me start with an image that brings us back to the 1960s and the years when I was a student here, and when, as a politicized students with many friends, we were extremely hostile to what the kind of projects that you see here. This is the well-known project by Paul Mémon to bury a very, very complex and layered city under the bed of the Seine River. This was exactly the type of projects we loved to hate. They were representing technocratic, apolitical. Mémon was, by the way, extremely conservative, if not almost fascist in his political opinions, but that's not the issue. We were extremely hostile to these questions of, in a way, neglecting the conflicts and the problems of the city. There are still seats in the foreground. don't stay all stuck in the back rows. It's depressing to see empty seats on the first row. Okay, so this architecture, this underground architecture, this underground urbanism was exactly. Thank you, Alessandra, to give the take the lead in the downwards migration. So it was the kind of architecture we really considered as totally irrelevant, and we were not ripe to historicize it as it is now done by many of my colleagues. So I've encountered the question of underground architecture in several projects, in particular in working on a character called Eugène Hénard, an architect doing visionary town planning at the beginning of the 20th century. And I will return, I'm now, you will see probably in 2 months a new publication of the remarkable texts of Hénard, published by the Édition de la Villette here, and with many totally forgotten stories and also texts by Hénard. But I will come to that later. Looking at Hénard and at the way in which the city was understood in the early years of the 20th century, not only as growing vertically as a city rising, but also as a sort of city plunging down. Working on Hénard, it's difficult not to mention some precedents in the development of underground planning and engineering. In the case of Paris, of course, we could talk at length about the sewers and the various systems that were the underground double of Haussmann's Paris. Without the sewers of Belgrand, without the what I would say the intense crisscrossing of Paris under the ground by all these systems, there would not be any Haussmannian reconstruction over the ground. And here I'm just showing you the one of the most interesting public works implemented, the covering of the Canal Saint-Martin under Boulevard Richard Lenoir. It's a remarkable piece of urban engineering and the first really large-size underground piece of development in Paris. Another interesting episode, one tends to forget it today, is the development of the railways, and many often with multiple layers of circulation. I could have shown you the amazing combination of levels at the Gare Saint-Lazare, which fascinated so much painters like Monet, Manet, or Caillebotte. Here, the Gare d'Orsay, built in 1900 by Victor Laloux, was an amazing example of, as the German used to say, Hochbau, high building above the ground, and Tiefbau, construction under the ground. The Gare d'Orsay was made possible because the railways of the Paris-Orléans line were buried and continued underground until almost until the Gare d'Austerlitz. The project by Laloux had a very significant impact in New York. And here I want to show you the most amazing projects that ever developed for many years in New York. Grand Central Station and Grand Central Terminal. What we see here is the not only a station, Grand Central Station, but also the covering of entire tracks of railways that were put underground thanks to the use of electric engines, and over which a new layer of city was built. It's a very important moment because it's in the history of the making of city, because it's probably the first time that developers didn't buy a piece of land on which they could build, but a piece of air. They bought nothing. They bought the right to build, to dig foundations through the railways in order to hit ground. But what is interesting here is this layering of two systems, a transportation system, which was very efficient and high-tech for the time, and an urban system. This is, I think, a major stage in the mutual development of the invisible structure of a city and the visible city. and was considered as such by many European observers, in spite probably the work of Sant'Elia, La Città Nuova by futurist architect Sant'Elia, took its cue from the ideas which had been implemented in New York. At the same time, Paris was building its subway and was building the subway according to various technologies. This is the simplest one, opening a street here, Rue de Rivoli, and creating an underground passage for the tracks. The work of Hénard directly comes from the observation of a subway. Hénard was an employee of the city of Paris, although he built 2 or 3 schools on his own account, and he was interested in adapting the city to modern circulation. Here you see here his Street of the Future, which was shown at the 1910, the first ever town planning conference in London in 1910. And you see how he imagines a city of buildings with flat roofs, buildings which have underground garage, which have for automobiles, also underground garage for these very primitive helicopters. They were called B airplanes and were derived from the ones described in the novels of Herbert J. Wells, like Anticipations, for instance. So here we have a direct impact on the architectural thinking of what is being written by forward thinking intellectuals. If you look at the section in more detail, it is a layered section. You see at least 3 layers of transportation, and the idea that the street, that Hénard has worked very closely on the circulation in Paris, as I will tell you in 1 minute. And here, the attempt at separating the levels and the types of streets, it's important. It is very clear in my mind that the famous mantra of Le Corbusier, one of several, Le Corbusier loved clear numbers, 4 functions, 5 points, 4 compositions, and 7 ways, 7 roads, the 7 V's of Le Corbusier, directly derived from the ordering of roads in Paris proposed by Hénard. Hénard also worked on, for the first time, on the segregation between pedestrians and automobiles. This is one of these studies on the transformation of Paris, published between 1903 and 1909, in which he proposes a new type of urban crossroads. You see that the cars, essentially horse-drawn carriages, are circulating on the ground, and that there is a very wide pedestrian surface under the ground. Hénard, by the way, was the first to imagine circular circulation, circular traffic in a roundabout, a very successful device in urban planning. The ideas of Hénard were known in America and were one of the sources of the highly imaginative images we find in American publications beginning in 1908 or 1910. Here, a cover of serial which was essentially promoting and selling photos of a real city, but with covers alluding to the future of New York, King's views of New York, and you see how the road, in this particular case, we're looking at Broadway. We see here the Singer building by Ernest Flagg, which was built on Broadway. Broadway looking north from the Battery, and we see that the street has become a sort of very deep canyon. It's exactly the notion that Sant'Elia gives in his manifesto of 1914. We also see the same ideas in these other view, probably much more successful, at least in Europe, published in the Scientific American of 1914. The delineator was very interesting. The designer, there was a designer, as very often, and a delineator who did the final drawing. Don't stay up there. There are seats in the front, and I won't be offended if you leave early. Donc venez devant, il y a de la place. Il y a encore des prie-dieux près de l'autel, comme on dit à l'église. Yes, the designer of this view was Harvey Wiley Corbett, one of the most important New York architects between 1910 and 1950. And we see an exaggeration of the idea of Hénard. Look at there is an underground city, multi-layered underground city under the city itself. So what it shows is a type of urban system that grows both upwards and downwards. Again, layered, upwards, downwards, complex, differentiated types of circulation and activities. It is one of the most important schemes, images, even as an image of the times, as it was very quickly republished in the very popular French weekly L'Illustration, and in all its foreign edition, like L'Illustrazione Italiana, where it was seen by Sant'Elia, published also in Russia, published in Germany. In 1910, two very important events take place in the history of city planning. I've mentioned London and the Town Planning Conference, where Hénard shows his City of the Future, and the other event takes place in Berlin. The city planning exhibition organized by Werner Hegemann, where these plates are presented. So it's the first city planning exhibition where cities are discussing mutually their projects. And here is a later plate. I always like to be very specific in discussing the circulation of images. This plate comes from Le Corbusier's book Urbanisme, or The City of Tomorrow, published in 1925, where he republishes plates of the 1910 exhibition that he had seen, by the way, showing the city developing into the depth. On the top, the rather realistic and I think very well observed superposition of elevated railways and underground trains in New York, and at the bottom, the deep lines of the London Underground. So all the people thinking who were thinking in progressive terms at the destiny of the cities at that time were imagining a layered city in which deep spaces would be very important. And some of these deep spaces were also being built in Paris. I take here two examples from the subway. The first one on the left is by Lucien Bechmann, an architect who will later be the planner, the designer of the Cité Universitaire. We see the underground salle d'échange at the Gare Saint-Lazare subway stations with beautiful tiles still existing. Bechmann, Gare Saint-Lazare, around 1912. And on the right, this is a view, and I really like these section/perspectives, sectional perspectives. This one shows us the subway station Les Abbesses in Montmartre. As you know, the subway runs deep under Montmartre, and devices had to be found to connect the level of the tracks and the ground. And this is a good example built in Paris. In the 20s, forward-leaning architects imagine cities where, again, underground developments and developments in the air would be paired. And this is probably the most striking of these projects, one designed in 1924 by Ludwig Hilbersheimer in Berlin. Hilbersheimer, it's called in German the Hochhausstadt, the high-rise city. But as you see, the project is not rising only into the height, it is also developing under the ground. This project was a response to Le Corbusier's contemporary city and was often compared with it. This idea of here, you see very clearly the dual city, these very elegant and extremely frightening slabs above the ground, and subways networks under the ground. When you think of a very successful movie of the same decade, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, you find the same dichotomy. The rulers, and you know that Fritz Lang's Metropolis is a love story but cast in a very violent social conflict. The rulers reign from the top of the big building, of the skyscrapers, and the masses, the toiling masses, work in the underground. So the idea, this image of the city from below and the city from above is very significant. In the 1930s, there will be many reflections in, around the world on the question of finally implementing underground networks. And the most radical ones will develop probably in Paris with the work of an organization called the GECUS, G-E-C-U-S, masterminded and led by a city planner called Utudjian, U-T-U-D-J-I-A-N, Utudjian. And he developed a system of underground roads for Paris, which he exhibited at the 1937 International Exposition. What you see here is a later view of his system as published on this the cover of the magazine Le Monde Souterrain, which was the expression of GECUS. Other planners worked on these ideas and proposed alternatives. Here is the work, for instance, of Gaston Bardet. Gaston Bardet was a young French city planner who worked on the question of underground freeways and made his own proposals in contrast to the one of Utudjian, by the way, borrowing the general layout of Hénard for Paris as drawn in the around 1909 or 1910. So anyway, long-standing obsession with underground roads in the case of Paris. But nothing happens. What happens during those years? Where is the public money going? The public money, French one, is being what I would say, buried in the eastern and northern frontiers of the country with the construction of the Maginot Line. The French are, as famously said, the French military are always late by one war. I would say sometimes by two. So here they had not imagined that the Germans could attack with tanks. Well, anyway, don't want to speculate on the history of World War II, but anyway, billions and billions were buried to build this 300 kilometers long Maginot Line, stretching from the Swiss to the Belgian border. And a very interesting system, because the ligne Maginot, it is often forgotten, was not almost invisible on the ground. It was essentially an underground system, an underground scheme, derived from the experiences of World War I, of the good resistance of underground shelters. And what you see here in the Daily Express is a completely fantastic, of course, hallucinated and exaggerated view of the Maginot Line as a very deep, almost as a complete underground city. So you see the parallel with what we saw before. This was clearly for propaganda purposes, meant to reinsure the French or the British readers and scare the German leaders, who were quietly imagining alternatives. You see a gallery on the right. Here we see, I think it's an interesting comparison. We see on the top a map where you clearly realize that the Maginot Line had only very, very little points of visible points over the ground. And this perspective shows us the sunken system, the sunken labyrinth over dozens of kilometers with underground trains, which was hidden and only appearing in one point or the next. The Maginot Line can be compared to a fleet of sunken dreadnoughts, of sunken cruisers, which would only emerge through their the points where you had the forts where you had artillery. And overall, it functioned quite well during the war. The French did lose the war for other reasons. When the war developed, new issues appeared. And here I want to stop and focus on what is the center of this talk today. World War II and the question of World War II in the underground, or World War II and the question of visibility. The Second World War is a remarkable one, at least the first in the history of warfare, as it is the first war in which populations and people located hundreds of miles away, hundreds of kilometers away from the front are more threatened and become more obvious targets than the military on the front. This is, of course, due to the development of aviation. And the question, therefore, of hiding production, creating hidden facilities for production, as World War II has been essentially an industrial war, hiding facilities on one hand and hiding people and forces on the other hand. Sometimes hiding cities became very important in order to create two types of effects. The first one was preventing buried factories from being destroyed, and the second, the use of the manipulation of vision through camouflage had another purpose, avoiding facilities to be detected or creating a doubt in the mind and in the vision of aviators flying over them. So if we look at the underground facilities, there are some very significant developments in Germany. As Germany is systematically bombed beginning in 1942, the Germans bury their production, and in particular bury the production of their secret weapons. Here the V1 pilot, one could almost call them drones today, they were here produced in a particular environment, the underground factory of Dora in the Harz Mountains. Peculiar for various reasons. The factory uses underground facilities, grottos and galleries that had been dug to create a strategic fuel reserve for the German army. But the second is more tragic. Dora is operating as the branch of a nearby concentration camp. Hence, the factory it is a place where rockets and other material is produced by prisoners in a sort of underground prison/concentration camp. And you can see these galleries here on the plan and the systematic ordering of the workshops, of the tunnels in which prisoners were working. So they were producing V1s here or other type of material here more working on the engines. It is striking to see, if you look at the history of World War II, that the highest level of industrial output of the German airplane and ammunition factories was the month of January 1945, after 3 years of Allied bombing, and at a moment in which the Allies had already recaptured all of France, all of Belgium, and a great part of Holland, and were on German ground. And this was due to two factors. One was the systematic use of prisoners, and one was the systematic use of underground facilities. The use of prisoners is one of the reasons why Albert Speer was sentenced at the Nuremberg trial in 1945 to 20 years in jail. He was not sentenced because this is important to say that, because he was a lousy neoclassical architect, but because he was a very efficient organizer using slave labor. Okay? Another example is our plans I found in the archive of a technical university in Munich for underground facilities designed and partly built for the Messerschmitt airplane company. These are plans of late 1944, and you see the system of galleries which were meant to be built in the south of Bavaria. The architect is a guy called Eberhard Kuhn. I don't know what life he had after the war, maybe very successful like all of these guys. And here's another project, very interesting project called Weissestal, White Valley. And you see on the situation map on the left that this project was built on two sides of a valley. On the right, the details show you the sophistication of the engineering. So, I mean, this dream of completely burying the war production almost operated. The Germans were not defeated because they could not build airplanes. They were defeated in part because they had no rubber, because they had no fuel. They were short on fuel and for other strategic reasons. So now the other aspect I want to underline is the question of visibility and the manipulation of vision. And here I am referring to a story that begins in the late 20s, mid-20s. Most powers in Europe, the US are a little backwards in this respect, and Canada even more. Most European powers begin to imagine a future war in the air. Committees are created for the organization of civilian defense in England, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in Russia, in Spain. And forward-thinking military leaders begin to imagine what an war could be. One of them is the Lieutenant Colonel Vautier, who writes in 1930 this book on the air danger and the future of the country. Great bestseller. In the book, Vautier analyzes a series of architectural and urban projects and concludes that the best projects for a city that would resist to the air war are the projects of Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier immediately writes to him. They became good friends, and Le Corbusier uses this discourse in order to promote his project, the Radiant City, as you see on the right wing plate from the Radiant City, a project developed between 30 and 35. You see that bombs bounce on the concrete roof of these buildings. You see that asphyxiating gas just spread out without harming anyone between the pilotis. In short, that his architecture is war-proof. And Le Corbusier will continue to be in close relationship with Vautier until World War II. He will even invite Vautier to the 5th Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, the 5th CIAM in Paris in 1937. At that time, and it's, by the way, exactly the same year, the question of air raid protection, civilian protection, invades the pages of all the architectural magazines in Europe. Here, a special issue of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, discussing the vulnerability of Paris to air attacks and proposing various solutions. One solution is simply evacuation. Leave the city, have millions of people leave the city, and of course this impacts the road network and becomes a stimulus to the development of a freeway, a plan for the construction of freeway around Paris, and especially a freeway from Paris to the provinces. But there is also a sort of morphological discussion on the adaptation of buildings to the war effort. And here one sees 2 pages of this issue of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui with systems, in particular on the right, to reinforce the basements of buildings and to create a sort of underground layer, urban layer for which could be used during air raids. So as if the city over the ground would move under the ground periodically during the air raids. Architects are getting ready, and L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, this issue is particularly interesting because it is based on images found in German handbooks, in English handbooks, in Italian publications, etc. The World War I doesn't begin on September 1st, 1939. It begins in July 36 with the Spanish War, with a civil war in Spain. And very early in Spain, where the Italians and the Nazis have brought their aviation, the question of air raid protection is raised. And for the first